The steady beep of monitors fills the ICU as Sarah checks her patients. Just another ordinary night shift. Paramedics burst through the doors with an unconscious young woman. No ID, no family, just another Jane Doe. As Sarah examines the patient, she freezes. A small crescent-shaped scar makes her heart skip a beat. 18 years ago, Sarah had a sister named Emma. They shared secrets, dreams, and that distinctive scar. Sarah thought Emma died in a car accident at 8. The grief shaped her entire life. But looking at this mysterious patient now, Sarah's world begins to crumble. Could this be Emma? The patient's injuries suggest she was running. Expensive clothes hint at wealth, but her eyes show sadness. Sarah holds the patient's hand, whispering their childhood lullaby, hoping for recognition. The night Emma supposedly died haunts Sarah. Her body was never found, lost in the river. Among the patient's belongings, Sarah finds clues to a life of luxury she never knew Emma could have lived. Sarah begins investigating. Something about this case doesn't add up, and she's determined to find the truth. For a brief moment, the patient's eyes flutter open, looking directly at Sarah with confused recognition. Sarah remembers how they used to sing, "You Are My Sunshine," every night before bed, promising never to leave each other. Against all protocol, Sarah decides to stay by this patient's side until she wakes up completely. Dr. Rodriguez warns Sarah about getting too emotionally involved, but she can't shake this feeling. "Emma, if that's really you, please give me a sign. I've missed you every single day for 18 years. That night, Sarah calls the detective who handled Emma's case, determined to reopen the investigation. Detective Park agrees something was suspicious about the original case. Too many loose ends, too many questions. Sarah refuses to leave the hospital, spending every free moment by the mysterious patient's side. As dawn breaks, the patient's eyes slowly open, and for the first time in 18 years, Sarah dares to hope her sister might be alive. Before we continue this incredible journey, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, give this video a thumbs up if you're hooked, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that prove miracles do happen. Sarah spends her lunch break discreetly investigating the mysterious patient, careful not to draw attention from her colleagues. The woman arrived with no identification, no emergency contacts, and no medical history on file anywhere in the system. Her expensive designer clothes and jewelry suggest a life of wealth and privilege far beyond anything Sarah has ever known. The contrast between the patient's obvious luxury and Sarah's humble background raises countless questions about how Emma could have lived such a different life. Every detail Sarah uncovers makes the mystery deeper and more compelling. Among the patient's belongings, Sarah discovers items that speak to extraordinary wealth and sophistication. A designer handbag that costs more than Sarah's monthly salary, diamond earrings that sparkle under the hospital lights, and clothes with labels from exclusive boutiques. But despite all the luxury, there are no family photos, no personal mementos, nothing that suggests genuine human connections or love. The woman's manicured hands show she's lived a life of comfort, yet her face carries a sadness that money clearly couldn't heal. Sarah wonders how the little girl she remembered as Emma could have ended up living such an isolated, privileged existence. Sarah's unusual interest in the Jane Doe patient doesn't go unnoticed by the hospital administration. Her supervisor calls her in for a meeting, expressing concern about Sarah's emotional involvement with this particular case. Hospital policy strictly prohibits nurses from getting personally attached to patients, and Sarah's behavior has been flagged as problematic. Sarah tries to maintain professional composure while explaining her dedication, but she can't reveal the truth about suspecting this patient might be Emma. The warning is clear: maintain professional boundaries or face reassignment to another department. Late that evening, Sarah carefully examines every detail of the patient's belongings, searching for any clue about her identity or background. The clothes are from exclusive boutiques that cater to the wealthy elite, far removed from the modest stores where Sarah and Emma shopped as children. Each item tells a story of luxury and privilege, but also of isolation and control. The patient's jewelry is expensive but impersonal, the kind of gifts that come with obligation rather than love. Sarah realizes that if this is Emma, her sister has lived a completely different life than anything Sarah could have imagined. Dr. Rodriguez notices Sarah's intense dedication to the Jane Doe case and approaches her with genuine concern. He's worked with Sarah for 3 years and has never seen her so emotionally invested in a single patient. Sarah carefully explains her suspicion that this woman might be her sister who supposedly died 18 years ago, showing him the matching scars as evidence. Dr. Rodriguez listens with compassion, understanding the pain Sarah has carried for nearly 2 decades. He agrees to help her investigate discreetly, but warns her to prepare for the possibility that hope might lead to heartbreak. Sarah spends hours studying the patient's face, searching for traces of the little girl she once knew as Emma. The shape of her nose, the curve of her eyebrows, even the way she breathes reminds Sarah of her beloved sister. She whispers childhood memories into the quiet room, hoping that somewhere deep in Emma's unconscious mind, she might hear and remember. The steady beeping of monitors becomes Sarah's constant companion as she maintains her vigil. Every small movement, every flutter of eyelids gives Sarah hope that Emma might be fighting to return to consciousness. Hidden among the patient's jewelry, Sarah discovers a small silver locket that makes her heart race with recognition. The locket is tarnished and old, completely different from the expensive modern jewelry the patient was wearing. With trembling hands, Sarah opens it to find a tiny photo of 2 young girls that looks exactly like her and Emma from their childhood. The discovery sends shockwaves through Sarah's entire being, providing the first real evidence that this patient might truly be her lost sister. The locket represents a connection to their shared past that no amount of wealth or time could erase. That night, Sarah holds the patient's hand and shares memories from their childhood, hoping to trigger some response. She talks about the games they used to play, the secrets they shared, and the promises they made to always stay together. The patient's hand feels warm and familiar in Sarah's grasp, and occasionally Sarah thinks she feels a slight squeeze in response. She sings their childhood lullabies softly, the same song that used to comfort Emma during thunderstorms and bad dreams. In the quiet darkness, Sarah feels more certain than ever that she's finally found her beloved sister. During her break, Sarah researches everything she can about wealthy families in Chicago, trying to understand how Emma might have ended up living such a privileged life. She searches through society pages, charity event photos, and news articles about prominent families in the area. The research reveals a world of exclusive social circles, private schools, and gated communities that seem completely foreign to Sarah's middle-class background. She wonders if Emma was adopted by a wealthy family after the accident, but questions why no one ever told Sarah the truth about her sister surviving. As morning approaches, the patient shows increased signs of consciousness, her breathing becoming more regular and her eye movements more frequent. Sarah leans closer, speaking Emma's name softly and encouraging her to wake up. The heart monitor shows elevated activity, suggesting the patient is fighting to return to consciousness. Sarah's hands shake with anticipation as she realizes this might be the moment she's been waiting 18 years for. She prepares herself emotionally for either the greatest joy or the most devastating disappointment of her life. The narrator takes us back 18 years to that fateful October evening when everything changed. 10-year-old Sarah and 8-year-old Emma are walking home from their after-school program, their backpacks bouncing as they hurry through the increasingly heavy rain. Emma clutches Sarah's hand tightly, always the more timid of the 2 sisters, while Sarah tries to reassure her that they'll make it home before the storm gets worse. The sisters laugh together as they splash through puddles, completely unaware that this will be their last moment of innocent childhood joy. Their foster mother had warned them to come straight home, but the girls had stopped to help an elderly neighbor carry groceries, a kindness that would later seem tragically ironic. The narrator describes the horrific scene that unfolded at the Miller Street Bridge just 20 minutes later. Sarah remembers standing on the rain-soaked pavement, screaming Emma's name as police officers and paramedics rushed around the twisted wreckage of a car that had gone through the bridge railing. She had been told that Emma was in the car when it crashed, that her little sister had been thrown from the vehicle and swept away by the rushing river below. The adults kept telling Sarah that Emma was gone, that the current was too strong and the water too deep for anyone to survive. But even as a 10-year-old, Sarah noticed things that didn't make sense about the story she was being told. The narrator reveals how Sarah was questioned by Detective Morrison the next day, a kind but overwhelmed man who seemed eager to close the case quickly. Sarah remembers telling him that she and Emma had been walking home together when a black car pulled up beside them. The man inside had rolled down his window and called Emma by name, which confused Sarah because they didn't recognize him. Emma had seemed frightened and had pulled Sarah away from the car, saying they needed to run home immediately. Detective Morrison had written down Sarah's statement, but dismissed her concerns, telling her that traumatic events often create false memories in children. He assured Sarah that the car accident was unrelated to the incident she described. Back at their foster home, the narrator describes how the social worker, Mrs. Patterson, gently explained to Sarah that Emma's body had been swept away by the river and might never be recovered. Sarah clutched Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit and insisted that something was wrong with the story, that Emma would never have gotten into a stranger's car willingly. Mrs. Patterson attributed Sarah's doubts to grief and the natural difficulty children have accepting death. She encouraged Sarah to focus on healing and moving forward rather than dwelling on details that might not be accurate. The adults around Sarah meant well, but their eagerness to help her move on prevented them from taking her concerns seriously. The narrator recounts the 3-day search effort that followed, with rescue teams combing the river for any sign of Emma's body. Sarah stood on the riverbank each day, watching the boats and divers search the murky water while holding on a hope that Emma might still be alive somewhere. The search teams found pieces of clothing and a child's shoe, but Sarah insisted they didn't belong to Emma because the shoe was the wrong size. When the official search was called off after 72 hours, Sarah felt abandoned by the entire adult world. The police assured everyone that the river current had carried Emma's body far downstream, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were looking in the wrong place entirely. The narrator brings us back to the present as Sarah sits beside the mysterious patient, reading through the old police report she had requested from Detective Morrison's files. As an adult with medical training, Sarah can see glaring inconsistencies in the investigation that her 10-year-old mind had sensed but couldn't articulate. The timeline of events doesn't match the physical evidence, and the witness statements contradict each other in several key details. Most troubling is the fact that the car involved in the accident was never properly identified, and no driver was ever found despite the vehicle being registered to a shell company. Sarah realizes that what she witnessed wasn't a tragic accident, but something far more sinister. The narrator explains how Sarah studies the crime scene photographs with the trained eye of someone who has seen countless medical emergencies. The damage to the vehicle doesn't match the story of a car losing control and crashing through the bridge railing. Instead, the evidence suggests the car was deliberately driven off the road and positioned to look like an accident. Sarah notices that there are no skid marks indicating the driver tried to stop, and the impact pattern shows the car hit the railing at a specific angle that would maximize damage. Most importantly, there's no blood evidence inside the vehicle to suggest Emma was ever actually in the car during the crash. The narrator describes how Sarah shares her disturbing discoveries with Dr. Rodriguez, explaining her growing suspicion that Emma was kidnapped rather than killed in an accident. She tells him about the black car that had approached them, Emma's frightened reaction, and the inconsistencies in the police investigation. Dr. Rodriguez listens with growing concern, realizing that Sarah's childhood trauma may have been compounded by a massive cover-up. He suggests that if Sarah's suspicions are correct, then whoever took Emma 18 years ago had the resources and connections to manipulate a police investigation. The implications are terrifying because it means Emma's kidnapper is still out there and possibly still controlling her life. The narrator reveals how Sarah leans close to the unconscious patient and whispers about the day Emma disappeared, hoping to trigger some buried memory. She describes the black car, the frightened look in Emma's eyes, and how Sarah has spent 18 years believing she failed to protect her little sister. Sarah tells the patient about the guilt she's carried, thinking that if she had been faster or braver, she might have saved Emma from whatever happened that night. The heart monitor shows increased activity as Sarah speaks, suggesting that somewhere in her unconscious mind, the patient is responding to these painful memories. Sarah notices the patient's breathing becoming more agitated, as if her body remembers the trauma, even while her mind remains unconscious. As the night deepens, the narrator describes Sarah researching similar kidnapping cases, looking for patterns that might explain what happened to Emma. She discovers several cases from the same time period where children from foster care or troubled homes disappeared under suspicious circumstances, but the investigations were quickly closed due to lack of evidence. Sarah begins to see a disturbing pattern of wealthy families acquiring children through illegal means, using their influence to cover up the crimes. The realization hits her that Emma might have been specifically targeted because she was a vulnerable child in the foster system with no powerful advocates to search for her. Sarah's hands shake as she contemplates the possibility that her beloved sister has spent 18 years as a prisoner in a gilded cage, believing her real family was dead. The narrator explains how Sarah takes a personal day from the hospital to visit the Chicago Police Department, armed with her research and the inconsistencies she's discovered in Emma's case. She requests a meeting with Detective Lisa Park, a seasoned investigator known for reopening cold cases that other detectives had given up on. Sarah's heart pounds as she walks through the busy police station, knowing that this conversation could either validate her suspicions or crush her hopes entirely. She clutches the folder containing Emma's original case file, the crime scene photos, and her own detailed analysis of the evidence. The weight of 18 years of grief and unanswered questions feels heavy in her hands as she prepares to make her case to law enforcement. Detective Lisa Park listens intently as Sarah presents her evidence and explains why she believes Emma was kidnapped rather than killed in an accident. The narrator describes how Detective Park's expression grows increasingly serious as Sarah points out the inconsistencies in the original investigation. Park admits that she remembers the case vaguely and had always been troubled by how quickly it was closed without finding Emma's body. She tells Sarah that Detective Morrison, who handled the original case, retired several years ago under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and several of his cases from that period have since been questioned. Detective Park agrees that the evidence Sarah has compiled raises legitimate concerns about what really happened that night 18 years ago. The narrator describes how Detective Park pulls Emma's original case file from the archives, revealing details that were never shared with Sarah as a child. The file contains witness statements that contradict the official story, including a jogger who saw a black sedan speeding away from the bridge shortly before the accident was reported. There are also notes indicating that the car involved in the crash had been reported stolen 3 days earlier, but this information was somehow overlooked in the final report. Detective Park points out several red flags in the investigation, including the fact that forensic analysis of the vehicle was incomplete and crucial evidence was either lost or destroyed. The pattern suggests either gross incompetence or deliberate sabotage of the investigation. Detective Park accesses medical records from Chicago area hospitals, searching for any children who were admitted around the time of Emma's disappearance. The narrator explains how they discover several suspicious cases of children with injuries consistent with car accidents, but whose backgrounds don't match their supposed families. One case particularly stands out: a young girl admitted to a private hospital on the same night Emma disappeared, suffering from head trauma and amnesia. The girl was claimed by a wealthy couple who said she was their adopted daughter, but the paperwork was expedited in an unusual manner. Detective Park notes that the attending physician was Dr. Marcus Webb, who was later investigated for falsifying medical records but died before charges could be filed. The narrator describes how Detective Park creates a timeline of events, connecting Emma's disappearance to a pattern of suspicious adoptions involving wealthy families in the Chicago area. She explains that during the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were rumors of an illegal adoption ring that targeted vulnerable children from foster care and group homes. The operation was allegedly run by powerful individuals with connections to law enforcement and the legal system, which would explain how they managed to cover their tracks so effectively. Detective Parr tells Sarah that several families from that era have since been investigated for various crimes, including child trafficking and fraud. The scope of the conspiracy is far larger than Sarah had imagined. The narrator reveals how Sarah receives an urgent call from Dr. Rodriguez at the hospital, informing her that the mysterious patient has begun showing signs of distress and elevated brain activity. The monitors indicate she's experiencing nightmares or traumatic memories, and her vital signs are becoming increasingly unstable. Dr. Rodriguez tells Sarah that the patient has been mumbling incoherently, occasionally saying words like home and sister that only Sarah would understand the significance of. Detective Park realizes that the patient's condition might be connected to their investigation, suggesting that discussing the case has somehow triggered memories in the unconscious woman. They decide to return to the hospital immediately, understanding that time may be running out to get answers from the only person who can confirm what really happened to Emma. As they speed toward the hospital, the narrator describes Sarah's growing anxiety about the patient's deteriorating condition. Detective Park explains that if their suspicions are correct, the patient has been living under an assumed identity for 18 years, possibly suffering from induced amnesia or psychological conditioning. The stress of being hospitalized and separated from her controlled environment could be causing her suppressed memories to surface, which might explain the sudden change in her condition. Detective Park warns Sarah that recovering traumatic memories can be dangerous for someone who has been psychologically manipulated for so long. They both understand that they're racing against time to uncover the truth before the patient's condition becomes critical. The narrator explains how Sarah and Detective Park arrive at the hospital to find the ICU in a state of controlled chaos. Dr. Rodriguez meets them at the entrance, explaining that the patient has been experiencing severe agitation and has been calling out names and phrases that suggest she's reliving traumatic experiences. The medical staff has had to sedate her to prevent her from harming herself. But even in sedation, she continues to show signs of distress. Dr. Rodriguez tells them that the patient's brain scans show activity patterns consistent with recovered memory syndrome, indicating that her mind is processing long-suppressed traumatic events. The timing of these episodes, coinciding with Sarah's investigation, suggests that the patient's unconscious mind recognizes the connection to her past. Detective Park observes the patient carefully, noting details that support Sarah's theory about this woman being Emma. The physical similarities are undeniable, and the patient's reactions to Sarah's presence seem to confirm an emotional connection between them. Detective Park photographs the patient's identifying marks, including the crescent-shaped scar that originally caught Sarah's attention. She explains to Sarah that if this woman is indeed Emma, she's likely been living under a false identity created by her kidnappers, complete with fabricated medical records and legal documentation. The sophistication of such an operation would require significant resources and connections within the legal and medical communities. Detective Park realizes they're dealing with individuals who have the power to manipulate official records and cover their tracks effectively. The narrator concludes the chapter by describing how Detective Park officially reopens Emma's missing person case, 18 years after it was prematurely closed. She assigns additional resources to investigate the adoption ring connection and begins the process of obtaining court orders to access sealed medical and legal record from the time period. Sarah maintains her vigil beside the patient's bed, now more convinced than ever that she's found her beloved sister. Detective Park promises Sarah that they'll uncover the truth, no matter how powerful the people involved in Emma's kidnapping might be. The heart monitor shows the patient's vital signs stabilizing as Sarah speaks softly to her, suggesting that the presence of her sister is providing comfort even in unconsciousness. Both women understand that they're about to confront dangerous individuals who have spent nearly 2 decades covering up their crimes. The narrator explains how Detective Park's investigation leads them to the Harper Estate, a sprawling mansion in Chicago's most exclusive neighborhood. The property is surrounded by high walls and sophisticated security systems, suggesting the owners value their privacy above all else. Detective Park explains to Sarah that Margaret Harper has been connected to several charitable organizations that work with foster children, which could have provided her access to vulnerable kids like Emma. The Harper family's wealth comes from real estate investments and political connections that span decades, giving them the kind of influence needed to manipulate official records. Sarah stares at the imposing mansion gates, wondering if her sister has been living behind these walls for 18 years, completely unaware of her true identity. Margaret Harper receives them in her opulent foyer, a woman whose perfectly composed exterior barely conceals her nervousness at having law enforcement at her door. The narrator describes how Mrs. Harper's demeanor immediately raises red flags for Detective Park, who notices the older woman's hands shaking slightly as she offers them tea. Margaret Harper insists that she doesn't understand why they're asking about events from 18 years ago, claiming her memory of that period is fuzzy due to personal tragedies her family experienced. She mentions losing her own daughter in a drowning accident around the same time, which prompted her and her husband to become involved in helping disadvantaged children. Detective Park observes that Margaret's grief seems performative rather than genuine, and her answers to basic questions are too rehearsed to be natural. When Detective Park shows Margaret a photo of the hospitalized patient, the older woman's carefully maintained composure cracks for just a moment. The narrator describes how Margaret's face goes pale and her breathing becomes shallow before she quickly recovers and claims not to recognize the young woman. She insists that her adopted daughter, Emma Harper, is traveling in Europe and has been for several months, studying art history at various museums. Detective Park notes that Margaret provides this alibi too quickly and with too much specific detail, as if she had prepared this story in advance. Sarah notices family photos on the mantel that show a young blonde girl who bears a striking resemblance to her sister, but the child in the photos looks disconnected and sad despite being surrounded by luxury. The narrator explains how Detective Park begins asking more pointed questions about Emma Harper's adoption, requesting to see legal documentation and medical records. Margaret becomes increasingly agitated, claiming that all the paperwork was handled by lawyers who have since retired or died. She insists that Emma was legally adopted through proper channels after her biological parents died in a car accident, but she can't provide specific details about the adoption agency or the legal proceedings. Detective Park recognizes the signs of someone whose story is beginning to unravel under scrutiny. Margaret's increasing hostility and defensive posture suggest she's hiding something significant about how Emma came to live with the Harper family. In a moment of apparent vulnerability, Margaret Harper pulls Detective Park aside and begins to reveal fragments of the truth. The narrator describes how Margaret tearfully explains that she and her husband were desperate for a child after losing their biological daughter, and they may have bent some rules to complete Emma's adoption quickly. She claims they rescued Emma from a terrible foster situation and gave her a life of privilege and opportunity that she never would have had otherwise. Margaret insists that Emma has been happy and loved, completely unaware of her previous life, and that disrupting her peace now would be cruel and unnecessary. Detective Park realizes that Margaret is attempting to justify kidnapping by framing it as a rescue, a common psychological defense used by child traffickers. After leaving the Harper estate, Detective Park immediately begins making calls to arrange surveillance of the property and to obtain court orders for Margaret Harper's financial and legal records. The narrator explains how the conversation with Margaret has confirmed there were suspicions about Emma's kidnapping, but also revealed the sophisticated nature of the cover-up they're dealing with. Sarah sits in stunned silence, processing the reality that her sister has been living just 30 miles away for 18 years, completely unaware that her real family was searching for her. Detective Park warns Sarah that confronting Margaret Harper has likely triggered security measures, and the Harper family may attempt to relocate Emma or destroy evidence of their crimes. The investigation has entered a critical phase where time is of the essence. The narrator reveals how Margaret Harper immediately contacts her legal team and security consultants after the police visit, clearly panicked about the investigation closing in on her family secrets. She makes frantic calls to individuals who helped facilitate Emma's kidnapping 18 years ago, warning them that law enforcement is asking questions about the old adoption cases. Margaret's conversations reveal the existence of a network of corrupt officials, lawyers, and medical professionals who participated in the illegal adoption ring. She specifically mentions that the girl is in the hospital and may be recovering memories that could expose their entire operation. The scope of the conspiracy becomes clear as Margaret coordinates with co-conspirators to protect themselves and silence potential witnesses. Back at the hospital, Sarah notices that the patient's condition has changed dramatically since their visit to the Harper mansion. The narrator describes how the patient seems to be fighting to regain consciousness, her brain activity showing patterns consistent with emerging from deep psychological suppression. Sarah whispers to the patient about their visit to the Harper house, describing Margaret Harper and asking if she recognizes the name. The heart monitor immediately shows elevated activity, suggesting that somewhere in her unconscious mind, the patient recognizes and fears the woman who has controlled her life for 18 years. Sarah realizes that the patient's body is responding to the threat of being returned to Margaret Harper's custody, fighting to wake up and escape. Detective Park arranges for increased security around the hospital, recognizing that Margaret Harper and her associates may attempt to remove the patient before she can regain consciousness and testify. The narrator explains how Detective Park briefs hospital security about the potential threat, emphasizing that the patient is now a key witness in a major criminal investigation. She stations plainclothes officers throughout the hospital and implements strict visitor controls to prevent unauthorized access to the ICU. Detective Park also coordinates with federal authorities, as the scope of the adoption ring suggests interstate criminal activity that falls under FBI jurisdiction. The hospital becomes a fortress protecting the one person who can expose decades of crimes against vulnerable children. As evening approaches, the narrator describes how the patient's vital signs begin to stabilize for the first time since her hospitalization. Sarah continues her vigil, talking softly about their childhood and promising that she'll protect Emma from the people who stole her away. The patient's breathing becomes more regular, and her facial expressions suggest she's experiencing peaceful dreams rather than nightmares for the first time. Detective Park updates Sarah on the progress of the investigation, explaining that they now have enough evidence to arrest Margaret Harper and several of her associates. The heart monitor shows a steady, strong rhythm as Sarah sings their childhood lullaby, suggesting that somewhere deep in her unconscious mind, Emma recognizes her sister's voice and feels safe for the first time in 18 years. The narrator takes us back 18 years to when 8-year-old Emma first arrived at the Harper mansion, suffering from severe head trauma and amnesia from the stage car accident. Margaret Harper sits beside the hospital bed, speaking softly to the confused and frightened child, telling her that her name is Emma Harper and that she's her loving mother. The little girl's eyes show confusion and fear as she tries to remember a life that Margaret insists never existed. Medical equipment monitors her brain activity while Margaret feeds her carefully constructed lies about her identity, taking advantage of Emma's vulnerable state to implant false memories. The room is filled with expensive gifts and toys, but the child seems more interested in a simple stuffed animal that Margaret quickly removes, claiming it doesn't belong to her. The narrator explains how Emma's education was completely controlled by Margaret Harper, who hired private tutors to ensure that her adopted daughter never attended public school or interacted with other children who might ask questions. Emma excelled academically, but seemed isolated and melancholy, often staring out windows as if searching for something she couldn't name. Her tutors were carefully selected for their discretion and willingness to follow Margaret's strict curriculum that avoided any discussion of adoption, foster care, or missing children. Emma occasionally asked questions about her life before the accident, but Margaret always redirected these conversations, claiming that dwelling on the past would interfere with her recovery. The child learned to stop asking questions, but the sadness in her eyes suggested that some part of her knew something was missing. As Emma grew into her teenage years, the narrator describes how her relationship with Margaret became increasingly strained. Emma began experiencing vivid dreams about a red-haired girl who called her name and sang lullabies. But Margaret dismissed these as products of an overactive imagination. The Harper family dinners were formal, cold affairs where conversation was limited to Emma's academic achievements and carefully supervised social activities. Emma's father, Richard Harper, was a distant figure who rarely spoke to her directly, treating her more like an expensive acquisition than a beloved daughter. Emma felt like a performer in her own life, always conscious that her behavior was being watched and evaluated by the people who claimed to love her. The narrator reveals how 18-year-old Emma began secretly researching her own past, using the mansion's computer late at night when Margaret thought she was sleeping. Emma discovered news articles about missing children from foster care and began to suspect that her own story didn't match the official version Margaret had always told her. She found inconsistencies in her legal documents and noticed that her adoption papers were dated several months after the supposed car accident that killed her biological parents. Emma's research led her to missing person databases where she saw photos of children who looked remarkably similar to her childhood dreams and fragmented memories. The more she discovered, the more convinced she became that Margaret Harper was not her real mother and that her entire life had been built on lies. For years later, the narrator describes how Emma stumbled upon a cache of documents hidden in the mansion's basement storage area. Among the papers, she found medical records from her hospitalization 18 years earlier that contradicted everything Margaret had told her about her origins. The documents reveal that she had been admitted under a different name and that her injuries were consistent with being thrown from a moving vehicle rather than a car accident. Most shocking of all, Emma discovered newspaper clippings about a missing 8-year-old girl named Emma from Chicago's foster care system, complete with a photo that looked exactly like her childhood appearance. The articles mentioned that the missing girl had an older sister named Sarah who never stopped searching for her, a detail that made Emma's heart race with recognition. The narrator explains how Emma gradually became aware that her every movement was being monitored by sophisticated security systems throughout the Harper property. She noticed cameras in rooms she had never seen before and realized that her phone calls and internet activity were being tracked and recorded. Margaret's explanations about needing security for their safety began to sound more like excuses for imprisonment as Emma recognized the true purpose of the elaborate surveillance network. Emma understood that she was not a beloved daughter, but a valuable prisoner whose every action was controlled and monitored by people who would go to great lengths to prevent her from discovering the truth. The mansion that had always felt cold and unwelcoming now revealed itself as an elegant prison designed to keep her isolated from the outside world. The narrator describes Emma's first serious attempt to escape the Harper mansion, climbing over the garden wall during a security shift change she had carefully observed. Her heart pounds as she drops to the other side, tasting freedom for the first time in nearly 2 decades. But her escape is short-lived as private security guards quickly apprehend her. Margaret's reaction to Emma's escape attempt is swift and severe, installing additional security measures and restricting Emma's movements even further within the property. Emma realizes that she's dealing with people who have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries when it comes to keeping her captive. The failed escape attempt teaches Emma that she needs a more sophisticated plan if she ever hopes to reunite with her real family. Following her escape attempt, the narrator reveals how Margaret Harper arranges for Emma to receive regular treatments from a private physician who administers drugs designed to suppress her memory and reduce her motivation to ask questions. Emma begins to feel increasingly drowsy and compliant, but she fights against the medication's effects by secretly spitting out pills and forcing herself to stay mentally sharp. She realizes that Margaret has been chemically controlling her for years, using psychiatric medications to keep her docile and dependent. Emma's determination to find her real family becomes stronger as she understands the lengths Margaret will go to maintain control over her life. She begins planning a more careful escape, knowing that she needs to reach the outside world before the medication permanently damages her ability to remember her true identity. The narrator describes Emma's final, desperate escape attempt on the night she was found by paramedics and brought to Sarah's hospital. Emma had managed to override the mansion's security system during a thunderstorm that knocked out power to the main house, giving her a crucial window of opportunity to flee. She ran through the dark Chicago streets, pursued by Harper security vehicles, knowing that this might be her only chance to reach safety and find her sister Sarah. The chase ended when Emma was struck by a security vehicle and thrown from the road, suffering the injuries that left her in a coma at St. Mary's Hospital. Even as she lost consciousness, Emma's last coherent thought was about the red-haired girl from her dreams who had been calling her name for 18 years. The narrator concludes the chapter by revealing how Margaret Harper spent the hours after Emma's escape, coordinating a massive cover-up operation to prevent the truth from being discovered. She contacted corrupt officials in the police department and hospital administration, attempting to have Emma transferred to a private medical facility before she could regain consciousness. Margaret's panic intensifies as she realizes that Emma's hospitalization at a public hospital puts her beyond Margaret's direct control for the first time in 18 years. The network of conspirators who helped facilitate Emma's original kidnapping scrambles to protect themselves as they understand that their decades-old crimes are finally being exposed. Margaret's desperation grows as she recognizes that Emma's reunion with Sarah represents the complete destruction of the carefully constructed lies that have defined both of their lives for nearly 2 decades. The narrator explains how Emma begins showing the first signs of emerging from her coma as dawn breaks over the hospital. Her eyelids flutter with increasing frequency, and her breathing becomes more regular as her body fights to return to consciousness. The medical monitors show elevated brain activity, indicating that Emma's mind is processing the familiar presence of her sister nearby. Sarah notices the subtle changes immediately, having spent every possible moment at Emma's bedside over the past several days. Dr. Rodriguez confirms that Emma's neurological responses suggest she's beginning to overcome the psychological suppression that has kept her true memories buried for 18 years. The medication that Margaret Harper's private physicians had been using to control Emma's mind is finally wearing off, allowing her natural healing processes to take hold. Sarah leans closer to Emma's bedside and begins speaking in the soft, reassuring tone she remembers using to comfort her little sister during childhood nightmares. She tells Emma that she's safe now, that the people who took her away can't hurt her anymore, and that Sarah has never stopped looking for her. The heart monitor immediately responds to Sarah's voice, showing increased activity that suggests Emma's unconscious mind recognizes the familiar sound of her sister's words. Sarah describes their childhood home, their favorite games, and the way they used to sneak cookies from the kitchen after bedtime. With each memory Sarah shares, Emma's vital signs become stronger and more stable, as if her body is drawing strength from the connection to her true past. Dr. Rodriguez observes from nearby, amazed by the profound physical response Emma shows to Sarah's presence and voice. Emma's lips begin moving as she tries to form words, though her voice is barely audible and her speech is fragmented and confused. The narrator describes how Sarah strains to catch every syllable, recognizing fragments of their childhood lullaby mixed with what sounds like cries for help. Emma whispers words like sister, home, scared, and find me, creating a heartbreaking puzzle of suppressed memories fighting to surface. Her breathing becomes more agitated as she seems to be reliving traumatic experiences, but Sarah's gentle touch on her hand appears to calm her immediately. Dr. Rodriguez notes that Emma's brain patterns indicate she's transitioning between different levels of consciousness, processing both recent trauma and deeply buried childhood memories simultaneously. The medical team prepares for the possibility that Emma might experience significant distress as her memories return. Sarah begins singing, "You Are My Sunshine," the lullaby they shared as children, and Emma's response is immediate and profound. The narrator explains how Emma's facial muscles relax for the first time since her hospitalization, and a single tear rolls down her cheek as her unconscious mind connects with the familiar melody. Her breathing synchronizes with the rhythm of Sarah's singing, and the medical monitors show the most stable readings they've recorded since Emma's arrival. Sarah continues singing verse after verse, adding the personal lyrics they created together as children, and Emma's hand begins to move slightly, as if trying to reach toward the sound of her sister's voice. Dr. Rodriguez documents this remarkable response, understanding that music and familiar voices can sometimes unlock memories that traditional medical treatments cannot access. The ICU staff gather quietly to witness what appears to be a breakthrough moment in Emma's recovery. Detective Park briefs a team of FBI agents about the Harper family's criminal network and the immediate threat they pose to Emma's safety. The narrator describes how federal investigators have uncovered evidence of an interstate child trafficking operation that has been operating for over 20 years, with Margaret Harper serving as one of the key facilitators. The FBI has obtained warrants to search multiple properties associated with the Harper family and their known associates, expecting to find evidence of dozens of similar cases involving kidnapped children. Detective Park emphasizes that Emma is not just a victim, but potentially the key witness who can bring down an entire criminal enterprise that has destroyed countless families. The federal agents implement additional security measures around the hospital, understanding that the Harper family and their associates will stop at nothing to prevent Emma from testifying about her experiences. Emma's eyes slowly begin to open for the first time since her hospitalization, though her vision appears unfocused and confused as she struggles to process her surroundings. The narrator explains how Sarah's heart pounds with anticipation and fear, knowing that this moment will determine whether Emma recognizes her or remains trapped in the false identity Margaret Harper created for her. Emma's gaze wanders around the sterile hospital room before finally settling on Sarah's face, and for several long seconds, the sisters stare at each other in silence. Sarah whispers Emma's real name softly, and a flicker of recognition seems to pass through Emma's eyes, though she appears to be fighting against years of psychological conditioning that taught her to suppress these memories. Dr. Rodriguez monitors Emma's vital signs carefully, ready to intervene if the emotional shock of recovery proves too overwhelming for her system. The moment hangs in perfect suspension as both sisters wait to see if 18 years of separation can finally be bridged. Emma's mouth moves as she tries to form words, but the sounds that emerge are broken and hesitant, as if she's fighting against invisible barriers in her own mind. The narrator describes how she seems to be battling between two different identities: the Emma Harper that Margaret created through years of manipulation, and the real Emma who remembers her sister Sarah. Sarah speaks encouragingly, telling Emma to take her time and assuring her that she's safe now, that no one can force her to pretend to be someone else anymore. Emma's eyes fill with tears as fragments of genuine memories begin to surface, overwhelming the artificial personality that has defined her adult life. She whispers Sarah's name with increasing clarity, each repetition stronger and more certain than the last. Dr. Rodriguez observes that Emma's neurological responses indicate she's successfully accessing memories that have been suppressed for nearly 2 decades. The moment of true recognition finally arrives as Emma's confused expression transforms into one of wonder and disbelief. The narrator explains how Emma's eyes widen as she truly sees Sarah for the first time in 18 years, and her voice becomes stronger as she whispers, "Sarah? My sister Sarah?" The heart monitor shows dramatic spikes as Emma's emotional and physical systems respond to the reunion she has dreamed about for so long. Sarah nods through her tears, confirming that she's real and that she never stopped searching for her little sister. Emma tries to sit up in bed despite her injuries, reaching towards Sarah with trembling hands that remember the comfort of her sister's touch. Dr. Rodriguez notes that Emma's brain scans show remarkable activity in regions associated with long-term memory and emotional processing, suggesting that her true personality is rapidly reasserting itself. The artificial barriers that Margaret Harper spent years constructing in Emma's mind begin to crumble as the sisters reconnect. Sarah and Emma embrace for the first time in 18 years, careful not to disturb the medical equipment, but desperate to feel the physical reality of their reunion. The narrator describes how both sisters cry tears of joy and relief, releasing nearly 2 decades of grief, guilt, and longing in a single moment of profound connection. Emma whispers apologies for disappearing, while Sarah reassures her that none of what happened was her fault and that they're together now. The medical staff maintains a respectful distance, understanding that they're witnessing a miracle of human resilience and the unbreakable bonds of family love. Emma's vital signs stabilize at the healthiest levels recorded since her arrival, as if her body is finally free to heal now that her mind has been liberated from years of psychological imprisonment. Dr. Rodriguez documents this remarkable recovery, knowing that Emma's case will be studied for years as an example of how love and family connections can overcome even the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. As evening approaches, Detective Park enters the room with legal documents that will officially restore Emma's true identity and place her under federal protection during the investigation. The narrator explains how Emma, though still weak from her ordeal, provides crucial testimony about the Harper family's criminal activities and the network of accomplices who facilitated her kidnapping and imprisonment. Emma describes years of psychological manipulation, forced medication, and isolation designed to make her forget her real family and accept a false identity. Detective Park assures both sisters that Margaret Harper and her associates will face federal charges for kidnapping, child trafficking, and conspiracy, with Emma's testimony providing the evidence needed for conviction. Sarah holds Emma's hand as they discuss the long road ahead, understanding that healing from 18 years of trauma will take time, but knowing that they'll face it together. The heart monitor shows Emma's steady, strong pulse as she finally experiences the safety and love she has been searching for throughout her captivity. The narrator explains how Detective Park coordinates with FBI agents to execute simultaneous raids on Harper family properties across 3 states. Federal investigators have spent days analyzing Emma's testimony and cross-referencing it with evidence from other suspected victims of the adoption ring. The operation represents the culmination of a 20-year investigation into organized child trafficking that has finally gained the key witness needed for prosecution. Detective Park briefs the tactical teams about Margaret Harper's dangerous desperation and the sophisticated security systems protecting the Harper estate. The FBI has obtained federal warrants charging Margaret Harper with kidnapping, child trafficking, conspiracy, and racketeering under organized crime statutes. Additional warrants target corrupt officials, lawyers, and medical professionals who facilitated the criminal network over 2 decades of operation. Margaret Harper watches from her mansion's upstairs window as FBI vehicles surround the property she has used as a fortress for decades. The narrator describes how Margaret's carefully controlled composure finally cracks as she realizes that her empire of lies and stolen children is collapsing around her. She frantically destroys documents and computer files that contain evidence of her crimes, knowing that federal investigators are minutes away from breaching her defenses. Margaret's hands shake as she contemplates the reality that Emma's escape and recovery have exposed every detail of the criminal operation she spent years perfecting. The sophisticated security system that once protected her from discovery now traps her inside a mansion that has become her prison. Federal agents use loudspeakers to demand her surrender, but Margaret retreats deeper into the house, desperately seeking escape routes that no longer exist. Federal agents breach the Harper mansion and find Margaret Harper seated in her elegant living room, surrounded by the portraits of children she claimed as her own through illegal means. The narrator explains how Margaret maintains an appearance of dignified composure even as FBI agents read her rights and place her under arrest for federal crimes. She refuses to answer questions about Emma or the other victims, invoking her right to legal counsel while glaring defiantly at the investigators who have finally brought her criminal empire to justice. Margaret's arrest marks the beginning of a massive federal investigation that will expose decades of corruption involving child welfare agencies, family courts, and private adoption facilities. The FBI discovers extensive records hidden throughout the mansion, documenting hundreds of illegal adoptions and the network of accomplices who made them possible. Margaret's final act of defiance is to demand that her lawyers protect the other families involved in the adoption ring, showing no remorse for the children whose lives she destroyed. In the FBI's Chicago field office, Margaret Harper faces federal prosecutors who present overwhelming evidence of her role in organized child trafficking. The narrator describes how Margaret's expensive legal team struggles to defend against Emma's detailed testimony and the mountain of physical evidence recovered from Harper properties. Margaret attempts to justify her actions by claiming she provided loving homes for children who would have otherwise suffered in the foster care system. Federal prosecutors methodically dismantle her defense, presenting evidence that she specifically targeted vulnerable children for broken families to minimize the chances of intensive searches. Margaret's cold calculation and lack of genuine remorse become evident as she refers to the children as acquisitions and discusses their monetary value to wealthy families seeking illegal adoptions. The interrogation reveals the sophisticated psychological techniques Margaret used to erase children's memories and create false identities that would prevent them from seeking their biological families. FBI forensic teams work methodically through the Harper Mansion's basement, uncovering 20 years of meticulously maintained records documenting the criminal operation. The narrator explains how investigators discovered detailed files on dozens of kidnapped children, including medical records, psychological evaluations, and photographs tracking their transformation from missing persons to wealthy family members. Margaret's obsessive record-keeping proves to be her downfall, as the files contain enough evidence to prosecute the entire criminal network and identify victims who never knew they had been kidnapped. The basement reveals sophisticated medical equipment used for psychological conditioning and memory suppression, operated by corrupt physicians who treated the children like experimental subjects. Federal agents also recover financial records showing millions of dollars in payments from wealthy families seeking children, and bribes paid to officials who facilitated the illegal adoptions. The evidence paints a picture of a criminal enterprise that treated vulnerable children as commodities to be bought, sold, and psychologically manipulated for profit. Margaret Harper's legal team attempts to negotiate a plea agreement that would reduce her sentence in exchange for cooperation in identifying other victims and co-conspirators. The narrator describes how Margaret's lawyers present her as a grieving mother who made poor decisions after losing her biological daughter, attempting to humanize someone whose crimes span decades. Federal prosecutors reject the plea negotiations, explaining that Margaret's level of organization and psychological sophistication indicate premeditated criminal enterprise rather than grief-driven impulses. Margaret's refusal to show genuine remorse or acknowledge the trauma she inflicted on her victims demonstrates the narcissistic personality that enabled her to justify kidnapping children for personal satisfaction. Her legal team struggles with the overwhelming evidence and Emma's compelling testimony, which destroys any possibility of claiming the adoptions were legitimate or well-intentioned. Margaret's final strategy involves attempting to discredit Emma's recovered memories, claiming that her testimony is unreliable due to psychological trauma and medication effects. Emma provides comprehensive testimony to federal prosecutors, describing 18 years of psychological manipulation and chemical suppression designed to erase her true identity. The narrator explains how Emma's detailed recollections provide crucial evidence about Margaret's methods, including the specific medications used to suppress memory and the psychological techniques employed to create false identities. Emma describes the isolation, surveillance, and control that defined her life with the Harper family, painting a picture of sophisticated psychological imprisonment that went far beyond simple kidnapping. Her testimony reveals how Margaret used a combination of love bombing, gaslighting, and chemical dependence to maintain control over her victims' minds and emotions. Federal prosecutors document Emma's account of discovering her true identity and her desperate attempts to escape from the Harper estate. Emma's courage in testifying against her captors provides the foundation for prosecuting not just Margaret Harper, but the entire criminal network that enabled her crimes. Federal investigators work around the clock to identify other victims of the Harper adoption ring using the extensive records recovered from the mansion. The narrator describes how FBI agents contact families across multiple states whose children disappeared under suspicious circumstances during the past 20 years. Many of these families had given up hope of ever finding their missing children. But Emma's case has reopened investigations that were prematurely closed due to corruption or incompetence. The evidence reveals that Margaret Harper's operation was just one node in a larger network of criminal organizations that specialized in acquiring children for wealthy clients who couldn't adopt through legitimate channels. FBI agents coordinate with international law enforcement as evidence suggests some children were trafficked across national borders to clients in other countries. The scope of the criminal enterprise grows with each document analyzed, revealing a systematic operation that destroyed hundreds of families while generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. Under intense questioning, Margaret Harper's carefully constructed facade finally begins to crumble as federal investigators present evidence of her involvement in multiple kidnappings spanning 2 decades. The narrator describes how Margaret's attempts to maintain her dignified composure fail as prosecutors confront her with testimony from other victims who have been located and are now willing to testify. Margaret's justifications for her actions become increasingly desperate and contradictory as she realizes that her criminal network has been completely exposed and dismantled. She attempts to shift blame to her deceased husband and other co-conspirators, claiming she was merely following orders rather than masterminding the operation. Federal prosecutors methodically destroy her credibility by presenting evidence that she was the primary organizer and financial beneficiary of the child trafficking network. Margaret's final breakdown comes when prosecutors play a recording of Emma singing the childhood lullaby that she remembered despite years of chemical suppression, proving that the human spirit cannot be completely destroyed even by the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. Emma and Sarah watch television news coverage of Margaret Harper's arrest and the dismantling of the child trafficking network that destroyed so many families. The narrator explains how federal authorities announce that charges have been filed against dozens of accomplices, including corrupt officials, lawyers, physicians, and wealthy clients who purchased children through the illegal adoption ring. Emma feels a profound sense of relief and closure as she watches Margaret Harper led away in handcuffs, finally facing justice for the crimes that stole 18 years of her life. Sarah holds her sister's hand as they listen to news reports about other victims being reunited with their biological families, understanding that Emma's courage in coming forward has saved countless other children from similar fates. The news anchor reports that federal investigators expect to identify additional victims and prosecute more members of the criminal network as the investigation continues. Emma's recovery has become a symbol of hope for families whose children disappeared into illegal adoption networks, proving that love and determination can overcome even the most sophisticated forms of criminal manipulation. Emma opens her eyes completely for the first time since Margaret Harper's arrest, her mind finally free from the chemical suppression that clouded her thoughts for years. The narrator explains how her vision is clear and focused as she looks around the hospital room, taking in her surroundings with the awareness of someone truly awake after a long nightmare. Dr. Rodriguez notes that Emma's brain scans show normal activity patterns for the first time since her admission, indicating that the psychiatric medications are finally leaving her system. Emma tells the medical staff that she feels like herself for the first time in years, describing a mental clarity that she had forgotten was possible. Sarah and Emma spend hours talking about their childhood memories, with Emma's recollections becoming clearer and more detailed as her mind heals from years of manipulation. The narrator describes how Emma shares fragments of memories that survived Margaret's attempts to erase them, including dreams about Sarah that persisted despite medication designed to suppress them. Emma tells Sarah, I always knew something was missing, but I couldn't remember what it was until I heard your voice. Sarah explains how she never stopped searching for Emma, visiting every hospital and shelter in Chicago over the years, hoping to find any trace of her missing sister. The sisters sing their childhood lullaby together, with Emma remembering every word despite 18 years of separation and psychological conditioning. The narrator explains how Emma's voice is weak but determined as she joins Sarah in the song that sustained her through the darkest moments of her captivity. Emma tells Sarah that she would hum this melody whenever Margaret's doctors gave her medication, using the familiar tune to anchor herself to memories they couldn't completely erase. The heart monitor shows Emma's most stable readings, yet, as the sisters harmonize, their voices blending in perfect unity despite the years that have passed. Dr. Rodriguez documents this remarkable moment as evidence of how music and family bonds can preserve identity even under extreme psychological manipulation. Emma breaks down in tears as she fully comprehends the scope of what was stolen from her and the pain her family endured believing she was dead. The narrator describes how 18 years of suppressed grief and trauma pour out of Emma as she mourns the childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood that were taken from her by Margaret's criminal operation. Emma apologizes repeatedly to Sarah for not being strong enough to escape sooner, but Sarah reassures her that surviving Margaret's psychological manipulation required incredible strength and courage. Sarah tells Emma, "You're the bravest person I know, and I'm so proud of you for never giving up hope." The sisters embrace as Emma releases the guilt and shame that Margaret had conditioned her to feel about her true identity. Detective Park arrives with official documents that legally restore Emma's true identity and formally charge Margaret Harper with federal crimes. The narrator explains how Emma's birth certificate, social security records, and legal identity are reinstated after 18 years of being listed as deceased. Detective Park tells the sisters that Margaret Harper and 12 of her accomplices have been indicted on federal racketeering charges, with Emma's testimony serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Emma asks Detective Park, how many other children did she steal? And learns that investigators have identified at least 37 similar cases spanning 2 decades of criminal activity. Sarah shows Emma photos from their childhood that she has treasured for 18 years, helping Emma reconnect with memories that Margaret's conditioning tried to erase. The narrator describes how Emma's face lights up with recognition as she sees pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and everyday moments from their life together. Emma points to a photo of them building a snowman and says, "I remember this. You helped me reach the top to put on his hat." Each photograph triggers additional memories, allowing Emma to reclaim pieces of her authentic self that survived years of psychological manipulation. Sarah tells Emma that she kept these photos in her wallet every day, looking at them whenever she felt like giving up the search. Emma and Sarah begin making plans for Emma's recovery and their life together once she's released from the hospital. The narrator explains how Emma expresses both excitement and anxiety about experiencing the normal world after 18 years of isolation and control. Emma tells Sarah, "I don't know how to do normal things like grocery shopping or making friends, but I want to learn everything." Sarah promises to help Emma adjust gradually, starting with simple activities and building confidence in her ability to make independent choices. Emma says she wants to complete her education and maybe become a counselor to help other trauma survivors, turning her painful experience into something that can help others heal. As the sun sets through the hospital window, Emma and Sarah make promises to each other about never being separated again. The narrator describes how Emma takes Sarah's hands and says, "I promise I'll never disappear again, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost." Sarah responds by promising to help Emma heal from her trauma and build the life she was meant to have before Margaret Harper stole her away. Emma expresses her desire to testify against Margaret and her accomplices, not just for her own closure, but to protect other children from experiencing similar trauma. Sarah tells Emma, "We're going to get through this together, just like we should have all along." Other family members and childhood friends begin visiting Emma, as news of her recovery spreads through their community. The narrator explains how Emma meets aunts, uncles, and cousins who attended her memorial service 18 years ago and are amazed to discover she's alive. Emma's former foster mother, Mrs. Patterson, arrives in tears, apologizing for not fighting harder to continue searching when the police close the case. Emma forgives everyone who gave up looking for her, understanding that Margaret's criminal network was sophisticated enough to fool law enforcement and social services. Each reunion helps Emma understand how much love surrounded her before she was taken, and how many people never forgot her despite being told she was dead. As the day ends, Emma and Sarah plan their first full day together once Emma is discharged from the hospital. The narrator describes how Emma wants to do simple things like walk in a park, eat ice cream, and see the city where she was born but couldn't remember. Sarah suggests they start by visiting their childhood neighborhood and the foster home where they live together so Emma can see the places that shaped their early bond. Emma says, "I want to remember everything about who we were before she took me away." The heart monitor shows Emma's peaceful sleep patterns as she drifts off holding Sarah's hand, finally experiencing the safety and love she's dreamed about for 18 years. 6 months after Emma's rescue, the narrator shows us the sisters walking through Lincoln Park on a crisp autumn morning, a routine they've established as part of Emma's healing process. Emma moves with growing confidence, no longer looking over her shoulder or flinching at unexpected sounds the way she did during her first weeks of freedom. She tells Sarah about the dreams she's been having lately. Not the nightmares about Margaret Harper, but beautiful dreams about their future together and the life they're building. Sarah points out the changing leaves and mentions how Emma is like the trees, shedding the old life that was forced upon her and growing into something new and beautiful. Emma laughs, a sound that becomes more natural and frequent with each passing day, as she picks up a particularly colorful leaf to press in the journal she's been keeping. Dr. Martinez, Emma's trauma therapist, had suggested the journal as a way to process her experiences and document her journey toward healing. The sisters have moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment near Sarah's hospital, creating their first real home together since childhood. The narrator describes how Emma is learning to enjoy simple domestic activities that were forbidden during her captivity, like choosing what to cook for dinner and decorating their shared space with meaningful objects. Emma tells Sarah, "I never knew that picking out curtains could feel so powerful, but every choice I make reminds me that I'm free." The walls are covered with photos from their childhood, recent pictures of their reunions with family, and artwork that Emma has started creating as part of her therapy. Sarah watches with pride as Emma experiments with cooking, laughing when she burns the garlic, but celebrating when the pasta turns out perfectly. These ordinary moments feel miraculous to both sisters, who treasure the simple freedom of being together without fear. Emma has enrolled in community college to complete the education that Margaret Harper's isolation prevented her from pursuing. The narrator explains how Emma initially felt overwhelmed by being around so many people her own age, but her natural intelligence and determination have helped her excel in her studies. She tells her psychology professor, "I want to understand how the human mind heals from trauma so I can help other survivors." Emma's classmates have no idea about her extraordinary past, and she enjoys the normalcy of complaining about homework and debating assignments like any other student. Sarah drives Emma to campus each morning, and they've established a ritual of stopping for coffee beforehand to discuss Emma's goals for the day. Emma's favorite class is developmental psychology, where she's learning about childhood trauma and resilience in ways that help her understand her own experience. Emma's testimony was crucial in securing Margaret Harper's conviction on federal racketeering and child trafficking charges, resulting in a life sentence without possibility of parole. The narrator describes how Emma found strength and closure in facing her kidnapper in court, refusing to let Margaret's cold stare intimidate her as she recounted 18 years of psychological manipulation and imprisonment. Emma told the judge, "Margaret Harper stole my childhood, but she couldn't steal my spirit or my love for my real family." The trial also resulted in convictions for 12 accomplices, including corrupt officials, lawyers, and medical professionals who facilitated the criminal network. Emma's courage in testifying has helped law enforcement identify 37 other victims, with many families finally getting answers about children who disappeared decades ago. Sarah supported Emma throughout the lengthy legal proceedings, attending every hearing and helping her sister navigate the complex emotions that arose from confronting her traumatic past. Emma has become a powerful advocate for other survivors of childhood trauma, speaking at support groups and working with organizations that help reunite families separated by crime. The narrator explains how Emma's story has inspired other victims to come forward and seek help, knowing that healing is possible even after years of psychological manipulation. Emma tells a group of survivors, "I thought I was broken forever, but I learned that the human spirit is stronger than any lie we're told about ourselves." She volunteers with the National Center for Missing Children, using her experience to help law enforcement understand the psychological techniques used by sophisticated trafficking networks. Emma's advocacy work has become a source of purpose and healing, transforming her pain into a force for protecting other vulnerable children. Sarah often accompanies Emma to these speaking engagements, serving as a reminder that family love can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. Sarah has returned to her nursing career with renewed purpose, specializing in trauma care and advocacy for patients who may be victims of abuse or trafficking. The narrator describes how Dr. Rodriguez has become both a mentor and close friend, supporting Sarah through her own healing process as she dealt with 18 years of grief and guilt. Sarah tells Dr. Rodriguez, "Finding Emma taught me that hope is never wasted, even when everything seems impossible." Her experience has made her more sensitive to signs of trauma in her patients, and she's helped identify several other potential trafficking victims through careful observation and compassionate care. Sarah has also started studying for her nurse practitioner degree, inspired by her desire to provide more comprehensive care for trauma survivors. The hospital has created a new protocol for identifying potential trafficking victims, largely based on insights Sarah gained from Emma's case. The sisters host regular family gatherings, rebuilding relationships with relatives and creating new traditions that honor both their shared past and their hopeful future. The narrator explains how Emma initially felt overwhelmed by large family events, but she's gradually learned to enjoy the chaos and love of extended family celebrations. Emma's cousin Mark tells her, "It's like you came back from the dead, but better because you're helping so many other people too." These gatherings always include Emma's favorite childhood foods and activities that Sarah remembered from their early years together, helping Emma reconnect with positive memories from before her kidnapping. Emma has started teaching the family children the songs and games she remembered from her time with Sarah, passing down traditions that Margaret Harper tried to erase. Sarah watches these interactions with deep satisfaction, seeing Emma reclaim her place in the family and create new bonds with relatives who never stopped loving her. Emma and Sarah spend Sunday mornings in their favorite coffee shop, planning Emma's future and discussing the dreams she's developing as she continues to heal and grow. The narrator describes how Emma has expressed interest in pursuing a master's degree in social work, with the goal of becoming a licensed therapist specializing in trauma recovery and family reunification. Emma tells Sarah, "I want to help other families find each other the way you found me, and I want to show survivors that healing is possible." Sarah has been accepted into a doctoral program in nursing, focusing her research on identifying and treating victims of human trafficking in healthcare settings. The sisters have also discussed the possibility of writing a book about their experience, hoping their story might help other families maintain hope during their own searches for missing loved ones. Emma says, "Our story proves that love is stronger than any evil that tries to separate families." The sisters commission a professional portrait to commemorate their reunion and healing journey, replacing the old photos that showed only their childhood together. The narrator explains how Emma insisted on this photo session as a way of marking her transformation from victim to survivor to advocate for others. Emma tells the photographer, "I want people to see that we're not just the sisters who were separated, but the sisters who found each other and built something beautiful together." The portrait captures both the joy of their reunion and the strength they've developed through overcoming unimaginable trauma and challenges. Sarah frames the finished portrait in their living room, next to the childhood photos that sustained her hope during 18 years of searching. Emma looks at the portrait daily, using it as a reminder of how far she's come and the bright future that lies ahead for both sisters. As we conclude this incredible journey, the narrator shows us the sisters sitting on their favorite park bench, watching the sunset over Lake Michigan and reflecting on the miracle of their reunion. Emma has grown into a confident, compassionate young woman who uses her traumatic experience to help others, while Sarah has found peace in knowing that her 18 years of hope and searching were not in vain. Emma tells Sarah, "I used to think that the worst thing that could happen was being separated from the people you love, but I learned that the worst thing is giving up hope that you'll find them again." The sisters have created a new family tradition of watching the sunset together every week, using this quiet time to appreciate their blessings and plan for their continued growth and healing. Sarah responds, "You taught me that love really can conquer anything, and that family bonds are stronger than any force that tries to break them." Their story serves as a powerful reminder that hope, determination, and unconditional love can overcome even the most devastating circumstances, and that healing is possible no matter how much time has passed or how severe the trauma has been. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, loss, and ultimate triumph. Don't forget to share where you're watching from, what touched your heart most about Sarah and Emma's story, and subscribe for more amazing tales that prove miracles happen when we never give up on the people we love.